Um, so the talk today, I'm going to be talking about two of my favorite things at the moment, Blazor and Tailwind CSS. Just to give you a bit of an idea of kind of where this talk is aimed at, I'm going to assume you know a bit about Blazor. I'm not going to go into sort of real fundamentals about Blazor or anything like that. The focus of this talk is kind of you're interested in Tailwind and how do I put Tailwind and Blazor together, because Tailwind, as we're going to discover, is slightly different to something like Bootstrap. So just before we go any further, just a quick slide about me. So my name is Chris. I'm a principal software engineer for a startup in London called Deployed. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, been one for about 3 years now. I have done a lot of blogging on Blazor, but I haven't been doing much for about a year and a half because I decided to write a book because I thought that would be a good idea, and that was a year and a half of my life gone. So yeah, but that's done now, and hopefully that should be going to print in the next sort of few weeks. So that's good. And finally, I do quite a lot of open source work. So I have an organization on GitHub called Blazor. Got some of the most downloaded packages of their type for Blazor applications at the moment, which is quite nice. Sort of the biggest one is Blazor local storage, but we have modals and toasts and things like that. And we've just hit a really big milestone recently. We've just gone past 4 million downloads, which is scary because that means 4 million people are relying on my code, which is, yeah, that's interesting. But it's also nice to see that Blazor's growing in popularity with that sort of uptake. So yeah, anyway, that's enough about me. Let's get into the actual main topic here. So let's talk about Tailwind CSS to start off with and what Tailwind CSS actually is. So Tailwind CSS is a utility-based CSS framework. So what does it mean to be a utility-based CSS framework? Well, let's draw a comparison with a sort of another well-established framework, Bootstrap. I would class Bootstrap as a component-based CSS framework. Now, what I mean by that is that with Bootstrap, you're going to, you're going to want to create a certain button, and you're going to, in order to do that with Bootstrap, you're going to apply a class that's called button, or button primary, or button secondary, or something like that, and that's going to have a pre-made style for that type of button. There's also more advanced things like cards and things where they have set layouts, and again, you apply a class of card and certain markup in a certain structure, and you get that look as well. Utility frameworks are very different to that. With utility frameworks, there are hundreds or thousands of very atomic CSS classes. What they usually do is target one specific CSS property. And you compose these together to create the look you want. Now, what this means is that you get a much more customized UI. We've probably all can tell a Bootstrap website from a mile away. It was kind of a meme at one point. That doesn't really happen with Tailwind because there aren't any pre-made styles. That's also possibly a trade-off for you, depending on how much you're into UI design or whether you work with a design team, okay? One thing that's also really interesting about utility frameworks and Tailwind specifically is that you pretty much never write CSS, which is an interesting concept. In fact, I'll make you a promise at this point in this talk. I'm going to do a load of demos, and I'm not going to write any CSS. Okay? Everything you're going to see in this talk is going to be using pre-made classes that are part of Tailwind. Slightly, I'm running the line slightly on that, but I'll call that out when I get there. But it's technically true. So let's have a look at what I mean by this anyway, and let's have a look at a concrete example. So this is the card component from Bootstrap's website, okay? So this is what I mean by it being like a component. So you apply this class of card on the main outer div, then you've got these sub-elements with various classes on them to style that card in a particular way. And this is a bit customizable. You can do the card without the image. You can miss out the card text if you want to and just have the title. It's up to you. There's a version as well where you can have a button on there and what have you. But the point is, you're constrained by what Bootstrap's provided for you. You have to use that markup and you have to use those classes. So what would this look like when we were doing this with Tailwind? Well, this is the same card. It looks the same. but the classes are different. So what we've got on that outer div now are very focused classes designed to create the look that we want. So flex is saying that we're going to use flexbox for the layout here. Flex col is about the directions. That's the flex direction property that's saying here. And we want this to be a column, which means the image and the div are going to get stacked horizontally. There's a shadow you can just see there on the bottom of that card. So we put shadow LG, large shadow, okay? The image, you probably can't quite make it out on here because it is a bit small, but there's slightly rounded corners on the top of that. So that's what rounded T is, rounded top. H40 is saying there's a height of 40. Now, 40 isn't actually 40 pixels or 40 rems. It actually maps to a value in a design system. So I'm going to talk a bit about that in a second. P4, again, padding, 4. That's going all the way around. Again, 4 maps to a number in a design system. And text gray 800, that maps to a particular shade in a color palette. Then for the heading, we've got text LG, text large, font semi-bold, and MB, margin bottom 2. So you can kind of hopefully start to see that these classes are quite readable once you kind of understand what Tailwind's naming conventions look like. And this is kind of one of the cool things I like about Tailwind, because I don't have to jump between a CSS file and my markup file to understand how things are styled. I can just see it straight here in my markup. So as I mentioned a second ago there about those classes, they map to a design system. Well, Tailwind is essentially a big design system. And this is quite an important thing. And the reason this is important is because using a design system puts us in a certain constraint, which means that you can keep things looking consistent and what have you, but you get a centralized way of configuring it. So Tailwind ships with a load of defaults that are really good, and you can build really good stuff with them. But if you do want to customize them specifically to your company design language or anything like that, you can do. So if you're working with a design team, they can actually provide you sort of your design language specifics. You can code them into Tailwind's configuration, and then the devs don't really have to worry about the styling as such, because they just use the various classes and they map to the right things in the design system. So let's just cover a few of these off. So the color palette, for example, okay? So Tailwind ships with a color palette with about 22 different colors in by default. They range for various different things, and they all look like this. They all have a starting value of 50 and an upper value of 900, and that's 50 being the lightest shade, 900 being the darkest shade. You can then use, these then get mapped into utility classes, and you can use them for various things where colors are appropriate. So text purple 700, for example, or BG gray 100 for background. Has the same thing for spacing. Again, I appreciate that's kind of slightly tiny, but as I was mentioning a second ago about that H40 not meaning 40 pixels or 40 rem, it maps to a number in this design system, which is the first column, and then in the configuration file, that is then mapped to an actual value. So these are the values that come by default. So for example, 4 is 1 rem or 16 pixels, and it's a proportionate system. So that means that 8 is double the size of 4 essentially. So it's a really good, sensible default. And the nice thing is here, what you kind of get away from is just random arbitrary values. If anyone's sort of built large-scale apps with custom CSS, you probably have seen what's happened where you end up with classes that are named very similarly because different people have done it at different points in time and not realized that a class already exists. And then you've got, say, 2 cards. This one's got padding of 16 and this one's got padding of 15. Because 15 and 16 are almost indistinguishable and no one knew it was there before, and you get these kind of slight differences all over the place. But with Tailwind, you just use 4 and that would map to, like say, 1 rem or whatever. And if we ever wanted to change that, like say we wanted more spacing by default, you could just up the value in the design system. You haven't got to go and change all your classes in your markup code. You just do it centrally and boom, everything goes up. So again, this can be used for various things, padding, width, height, all that kind of stuff. The other thing that is really cool about Tailwind is its support for variants. So variants are things like pseudo classes or media queries and stuff like that. So again, Tailwind has a whole heap of these that ship out of the box. And then you can use them to do stuff like hover effects or dark mode styling or odd and even color variations on a table, or styling first elements, or whatever you happen to want to do. And I think this is a really strong selling point of Tailwind, because this stuff is a bit of a pain to do with regular CSS. If you want to create a hover effect for a button, you're back in your CSS file, you're creating a duplicate of the class with a hover pseudo class on it, and then you're changing your styling and things like that. Well, to do the same thing in Tailwind, we just say we want BG red 500 by default, and when I hover over it, hover colon, I want BG red 800 applied, and that's it. I've now got a hover effect. I just want to really stress this. All this stuff is configurable. There is nothing in Tailwind that is fixed. Everything that's there, you can change, you can modify, you can adjust, and you can make it work the way that you want to make it work. But it's all optional. Technically speaking, you need to provide no configuration to Tailwind by default. Okay, you only need to provide configurations for the things that you want to change, or that you want to tweak and personalize. So a good way to think about utility frameworks like Tailwind is Lego blocks for UI design. What you do is you compose these classes together to create these looks, and if you don't like a particular element of that, cool, you just take out that particular utility class, apply a different one, and you can tweak that look and customize it. It's also a very rapid process. Like I say, once you learn the naming conventions for Tailwind, you can very quickly iterate through this. And because you're not jumping between CSS files and markup files, it's just a very rapid process. One of the main uses, I think, for Tailwind when it first came out, it got talked around a lot, being sort of being used as a prototyping framework for UI design, because you could just very quickly iterate on a design in a real app just by quickly applying these utility classes. Cool. So let's get a little drink here. Have a laugh at that while we're here. This is usually where people new to Tailwind start having a little twitch. If you're as old as me, and when we started doing web design in the 90s and things like this, you'll know about inline styles, and we're all very much encouraged to understand that inline styles are evil and we shouldn't be using them. And Tailwind does have a lot of similarities with inline styles. It does look that way. So let's deal with this head on. What are the limitations of inline styles? Why are they evil? Why shouldn't you use them? Well, it's not like everything. It's not like you shouldn't ever use them. They have their place, but generally speaking. Well, firstly, inline styles are just magic numbers or magic strings, depending on what properties that you're putting in there. You're going to declare them directly on an element by putting a style attribute in there, and they're fixed to that element. And if you want to repeat those styles somewhere else, you copy and paste them over to somewhere else. If you want to change them, you're also going to go in and you're going to have to change them everywhere you've put them, okay? There's no real way of centralizing values and things like that to make sure you're using consistent numbers or what have you, color codes, things like this. So it makes maintenance very, very hard. Pseudo states like hover and focus, they don't work with inline styles. So goodbye any kind of nice interactive UIs with hover effects and what have you. You're not going to be able to do that with inline styles. And probably one of the biggest ones in modern web development is that you can't use media queries. So if you have an app that needs to work on mobile devices and tablets and desktops, well, if you're going to use inline styles, then you're really out of luck. That's not going to work. So Tailwind uses classes. It's not inline styles. They're just really focused. Okay, and that's the only difference, and that's where that kind of similarity with inline styles comes from. But that's it. It just looks a bit similar. But all of the functionality that you get with regular CSS, you get with Tailwind. So now we've kind of learned a little bit about the basics of Tailwind. Let's talk about how we would actually start to use Tailwind with Blazor. There's two options we're gonna look at. The first one we're gonna look at is Tailwind's Play CDN. So this is a new thing that came out with Tailwind v3, which came out sort of tail end of last year. And it's really quite impressive. So in order to use this, it's really, really quick and simple. We add in a script tag to the Tailwind CDN, and then we just start writing our utility classes, and it just works. Okay? So really quick and easy to get going. The thing I'd like to make clear at this point is that the Tailwind guys are very, very clear about this. This is for non-production use, okay? So there's something to just be aware of. It's kind of designed for people who want to try out Tailwind, see what it's like to use it, maybe do prototyping, that kind of stuff, but it's not something that you want to use for production apps, okay? So that's why we're going to talk about the second option in a second. But what's, I think, some of the coolest bits about the Tailwind CDN is that you still get all the features that you would have if you actually were running this locally. So you want to customize the styles? Yeah, that's cool. That's not a problem. You can do that. We add a script tag, we add a Tailwind configuration object, and we can just configure this, okay? And that's going to do all of the same configuration that you could do as if you were running Tailwind locally. So that's pretty impressive stuff. So in this little code sample, I'm adding in a Blazor purple color here. And then I can just go and use that. So I can just go BG Blazor purple, and that's just going to work, okay? That's just going to build that on the fly. Now, just in case you're wondering how it does this, that script tag is basically going to process this, and what it does is it creates a style tag and basically puts all these styles in, it injects them dynamically into the host page. What's another cool feature of Tailwind is plugins. So there's various well, there's quite a lot of plugins actually for Tailwind. Tailwind has official plugins and it also has community plugins, and they cover lots and lots of different scenarios. And you can even use some of these plugins with the Tailwind CDN as well. Okay, you just put the plugins query string on there, and then you just say whichever ones you want to use. Now, you are limited to the official Tailwind plugins to do this, but you know, the fact it does this at all, I think, is still pretty cool. So that's the CDN, but I want to talk to you about a different option, which is the Tailwind CLI. So this is what I would suggest you use if you're actually going to build real apps with Tailwind, okay? And up till version 3, this was an NPM only thing. You know, you had to install NPM, you used NPM packages, which sometimes in the .NET community, especially, that doesn't sit well with people. There's actually now a new option here. So the Tailwind guys have created a standalone CLI now. So it's a standalone executable, doesn't need Node or anything. You can just download that from their GitHub releases page, and you can just reference it, use it, and it just works. You don't need to have Node or NPM or any of that stuff. Personally, it's not the option I would choose, because then you've got to deal with getting that executable somehow into your, say if you're using a CI pipeline, you've got to get it in there somehow and then run it and what have you. It becomes a bit of a faff. Personally, I do think the NPM option is the better option. And I'm going to show you using that today. And frankly, I don't think it's a particularly bad option. If you've got any other need for NPM, if you need to do, I don't know, say you need to do some JavaScript bundling or something like that for whatever reason, because your app might rely on it for something, you can plug that into that pipeline as well. So you'll be glad to know that's the end of the slides now. So we're going to go over to Visual Studio, and we're going to start having a look at how we can actually build this stuff. So that's not changing. Aha, there we go. So what we're going to do is we're going to work on a Blazor WebAssembly app for the rest of the session. So the first thing that we need to do here is we actually need to get Tailwind working with it. So how do we actually go about setting this stuff up? Well, the first thing we're going to do is I've got my terminal here, and I'm going to run this command npx. So I've got Node installed. I've gone and got the installer from nodejs.org. This npx command, a lot of people are still unfamiliar with it. It's quite a cool thing. I don't need a package JSON file or anything like that. I'm just going to say run this Tailwind CSS package, run the init command on it. If I don't have that in my Node cache, it's going to go off and get it for me and download it and run it. If I've got it, it will just run it. But it doesn't create a Node modules folder. I don't need a package JSON file or anything like that. So I can hit go on that. That's going to go off and create this Tailwind configuration file. So that's now sitting at the root of my project here. And this is all that it creates, okay? Now, as I said, technically speaking, you kind of don't need to change anything, but you kind of really do. The one thing you need to do is actually add something into this content area here. So we need to basically pass into it where what files are going to use our Tailwind utility classes. Okay, so we're putting in the path here, and this bit is just saying find any files inside of our application that have a Razor or an HTML extension. So our Blazor components and the host page for our app. Now, the reason we're doing that is because with Tailwind v3, they moved to the JIT engine by default. Now, what happened previously is that Tailwind used to generate a load of CSS classes when you first ran it. Now, they had to be quite selective about what classes they generated, because if you turn on all of the features of Tailwind v2, you would get about a 20 meg CSS file. And if you then try and load that in a browser, browsers get slow, the dev tools get slow. It's not a very good development experience. So they gave you some sensible defaults, and then you just turned on the other features that you needed. But this wasn't really a great option. So they worked on this JIT engine. And what this JIT engine does is you basically feed it the files that are going to contain your Tailwind utility classes. It will monitor them, and every time you add a new class, it will dynamically recompile the Tailwind CSS for you. So the Tailwind CSS will only ever contain the classes that you're actually using. But the cool thing about this is that all of the options that Tailwind has available, with all of its pseudo classes and variants and all this kind of stuff, are all turned on by default. You just use the class and it gets applied. So that's why we have to put this path in here, so that the JIT engine knows where to go off and look for these classes. So that's our configuration file done. The next thing we're going to do is just add in an initial input CSS file. So I'm going to create a styles folder here, and inside of that, I'm going to add in a new style sheet. There we go. So we'll call this app CSS, and inside of here, we're going to put in these 3 Tailwind directives. So Tailwind is going to process this file for us, and it's going to create an output CSS file that's going to contain all of those utility classes. And basically, these 3 directives get processed, and they generate various different things. So in the base layer, it generates a CSS reset. Okay, so you get a nice level base before it starts applying all of the various things it's going to do. Then it generates component classes and utility classes, and this is it's not really particularly important to worry about what these mean, but essentially it's just kind of making sure that the right styles can override the right things and they're all in the right order. So that's our input file. So now we've got that. So we've added that Tailwind configuration file, and we've added that input CSS file. So in order to get going, we then can run npx, and then we say Tailwind CSS, and then we say we're going to pass in an input file, that one that we just created. Oh, that's wrong. And then we're going to say we want to output a file into our www root folder, and we're going to call that app.css as well. And then at the end of it, I'm going to do this additional tag ---- watch. So what's going to happen here is the Tailwind CLI is just going to keep watching both that input file, that styles app.css, and it's going to watch all of those files we told it to watch, all the Razor files and HTML files for changes. All right, and every time we modify anything, it's going to rebuild that output file for us. Okay, so we hit go. So that's now generated that initial file for us. You can see there, 146 milliseconds, pretty fast, and we can go and see that in here. So there's all the reset stuff that it's generated, and if we go down, it will start showing us. There we go. So now we can start seeing utility classes. Okay, and these are ones that I've already got applied because I've already done some work here, because watching me apply all these across a whole site is going to be a little bit boring for you. So I've already done some stuff to do this. So the final thing I'm just going to do is quickly add a reference to that output style onto the index page here. And now let's see if we can have a look what we've got. Cool. So this is my reimagining of the default Blazor template. I've been working with Blazor since pretty much it was first kind of conceived as a experiment, and I don't know about any of you, but I'm getting kind of quite tired of the regular template and that purple that purple gradient down the side. So I thought I'd have a little bit of a play around and try and create something a little bit more interesting. So this is what our starting point is going to be, but there's a few bits here that need a bit more styling. So I thought we'll work through these together just so you can get a little bit of a feel of what it's like, to apply these Tailwind classes. So we're going to start by going over to the index page. So this is my index component. Now, I've got an H1 tag and a P class here. They haven't got any styles at the moment. So let's just go through and add some of these in. So in order to do this, the initial styling for this, I'm going to say I want a style on here of extra bold because I want my H1s to stand out a bit more. So if I just hot reload, go over. So you can now see that hello world has gone bold, right? I've just applied that first bit. The next thing I'm going to say is, well, I want it to be quite big because, this is a heading after all. So let's bump that up as well. So I want 7XL. I want it to be like really big text. And boom, I've got really big text. I'm also going to say I want tracking to be wider because, it'll space things out a little bit more, make everything look a little bit less compressed. Cool. So I've got a little bit of spacing now between the letters in my words. And finally, I'm going to say I want a margin bottom of 6 because it's pretty close to that P tag. So I can pop that in as well. And voila, I've now started my H1 tag. Now that's taken me sort of 20 or 30 seconds while I'm talking to you. If you can imagine, if I'm actually coding this up on my own, I'm just going to be tap, 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 done. And we can do the same thing for the P tag here. So the P tag here, I'm going to say I want text XL and I want a margin bottom of 20 on these because that's how the styling is going to work. Okay, and now I've got like this really huge, massive text for my P tag. Okay, so you can kind of see the process here as a developer. You're just going to apply these things, you're going to refresh and you get your styles, and you're just going to see very quickly what things look like, especially with Tailwind's hot reload and with Blazor's hot reload system. Okay, it's a very quick iterative process. Cool. 7XL, it shouldn't have been quite that big. Sorry, my bad. There we go. That's what it should have looked like. Sorry, I thought I was looking a bit big. Nice. So that's kind of just regular styling, okay, which is pretty bland and boring, right? That's pretty bread and butter stuff. So how about something a little bit more interesting? So this panel on the right-hand side is looking pretty dull. I want it to be kind of a big feature of this. It's kind of taking up a lot of space and what have you. So it'd be pretty cool. As the Tailwind logo's got a gradient, how about we put a gradient on the background, right? Now, this is something that I always find a bit of a pain in CSS. I would consider myself pretty competent with CSS, but I can never remember the syntax for background gradients. I always end up Googling this. It's just one of those things that won't stick in my head. So let's have a look at how we do this with Tailwind. So this div down here is the outer div for that. So I'm going to apply 3 classes. These 3 classes here. BG gradient to BR, that's background gradient to bottom right. It's going to start in the top left. And I'm going to say from green 400 to blue 500. Okay, so 3 classes. Save that. Do a reload. And boom, I've got a background gradient. Okay, so pretty quick, pretty rapid, and I haven't had to open Google, which is always a good thing. So that's a gradient, but let's have a look at something else we could do with this really rapidly. So we've got our background gradient stuff, but how about we just add a hover effect? So we'll use one of those pseudo classes, hover, and we're going to say this time when we're hovering, we're just going to reverse the gradient. So we're going to say from blue 500 to green 400 instead. Okay, same thing, but just the opposite way around. Let's reload that, go back over, and boom, now I've got a hover effect on my gradient as well. So these things are just pretty trivial to do with something like Tailwind. Okay, I'm not going off to separate files to do this. I'm not going to Google to check syntax. Okay, all I've got to know is the naming conventions that Tailwind has. The other thing that we'll just look at as well, just for completeness, is the survey prompt here I've got as an unstyled thing at the moment. So let's just quickly add some base styles in. So this now stands out a bit better. This looks a bit more interesting. But we can even do sort of what I would call more advanced things with CSS with Tailwind pretty trivially. So everything's really square on this page, and this is meant to be like a bit like a banner thing. So it'd be cool if it was a bit skewed, so it looked more like it was kind of pasted on the page, as it were. So how do we rotate elements and transform them? Well, even stuff like that in Tailwind is fairly trivial stuff. I'm going to apply 2 new CSS classes to create this effect. I'm going to apply transform, which just says I'm going to transform something about this element's position. And then I'm going to apply the rotate 3 utility class. And this one, if you'll notice, has a minus in front of it, which means that I'm going to want to rotate counterclockwise rather than clockwise. Okay? So I'll pop that on there. We'll reload our app again. And then we get a bit of skewing. So the reason I've showed you a few bits like this is just kind of to show you that sort of some things that are not quite so trivial in regular CSS are pretty trivial when you're using something like Tailwind. You can create some more advanced effects with not a lot of effort at all. So at this point, some of you may be thinking about repetition. Okay, so those classes we've got on this H1 and this P tag, right? Usually these are the sorts of things you want to be consistent across your app. You want all your H1s to be the same. You want all your anchor tags to be the same, right? Am I going to have to go and copy and paste this everywhere? Because that doesn't sound like a lot of fun, and I agree. So even though Tailwind kind of does encourage you to put your styles directly into your markup, you can still centralize styles for this kind of thing. Okay, so let's have a look at how we can do that. So what we're going to do is, if we go to that input CSS file that we created earlier, we can use a pretty cool feature of Tailwind called the apply directive. Now, this is where I said I was skirting the line a little bit, where I said I wasn't going to write any CSS. So technically, I am defining a class here. I'm defining the styles for the H1 type. But I'm not actually writing any CSS properties out. I'm just applying those same utility classes using the apply directive. So what's really cool about this is I can centralize my styling for common elements inside of here, but I can still leverage all the power of that design system. All right? So if I go and change the weighting of what extra bold is, for example, on the font that we're using, again, I just do it centrally in my design system. I'm not coming here and modifying it. Okay? So I can do that for the H1, and I can do that for the P tag. Okay? We can save that. That's all good. And if we go back over to our markup, we'll get rid of the styles that we added before. We're just going to have our regular H1 and P tags. We'll do a hot reload. And everything looks the same as it did before because we've just done the same styles were applied. You can see there's in the dev tools, we've got no class element, but there are those various properties that have been created by Tailwind for us. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature when you want to deal with these repeated styles. So that's one way of dealing with repetition. And that one I would very much say is like keep that to things like that H1 example there, where you're just repeating the styles. It's nothing to do with repeated markup. All right. As we're using Blazor, if we do want to deal with repeated markup, there's a different technique we can use for that. It's where components come in. Okay. Blazor, like other SPA frameworks nowadays, is all component-based, and these are very powerful tools. So that Tailwind panel that's on the right-hand side there, that is actually on all of the various pages. So what that means is we'd have the same HTML structure repeated across all the pages. We'd have the same utility classes applied to those and repeated across all the pages. So if we go and look at back into Visual Studio, we can deal with this, as I said, just using a component. So if I create a Tailwind component to represent that, that markup, and then inside of there, I can just paste in the markup that's repeated across those 3 pages. So I can do that, save that. I can get rid of the markup that's there. I can reference the component. I can do that on the index page. Come down here, we'll get rid of it on the fetch data page as well. And finally, we'll do it on the counter page as well. Get rid of that. So I'm just referencing that component across my 3 pages. New components, that's going to do a little rebuild. Cool. And now I've got that markup centralized. I've got all those styles centralized, and I'm just referencing that component across my app, okay? So with these 2 techniques, you can pretty much remove all of the duplication that you need to inside of your app, because there's not really many other scenarios where you're going to see duplication. You're either going to be duplicating classes on an element, or you're going to be duplicating markup with classes, okay? And you can either use the apply directive or components to deal with those scenarios. Cool. Right. So far, we've kind of been dealing with the kind of run-of-the-mill stuff that we need to get our heads around in order to start using Tailwind. So now we're going to start delving into some more interesting stuff. So what we're going to look at next is animations. Okay, animations are usually a bit painful. If you're writing Blazor apps, they're usually going to involve doing JavaScript interop of some form or another. No, that wouldn't be any good, would it? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can create a reusable animated component that doesn't use any JavaScript whatsoever. We're going to do this entirely with C# and Tailwind. Okay, so what we're going to do is on the home page, just to add a little bit more pop to it, we're going to have that panel slide in from the right-hand side, okay, as the page loads. It's only going to do it once. We're not going to want to give people headaches for this going over and over and over again. But it's just going to add a little bit of pop, okay? So let's go into Visual Studio and let's have a look at how we're going to do that. So first off, we're going to start off by creating a new component. So I'm going to imaginally call this the sliding component. And then let's have a look at the initial code. So in order to make this work, we're going to use a .NET timer, all right? And what we're also doing here is creating what's known in Blazor as a templated component. Now, what this means is we're going to wrap markup, and then we're going to take that markup that we've wrapped, and we're going to output it somewhere inside of this component so that we can do what we need to do. In Blazor, how we do that is we create a parameter with a name of child content. It has to have the name child content. It also has to have the type of render fragment. That's a convention for this to work. And what we're saying is whatever content we've wrapped, capture it in this property, and then we're going to output it inside of this div that we've got here in this component. Okay. And also, I realize this is just a demo in a talk, but I'm being responsible here. I do need to dispose of my timer afterwards, and someone very kindly pointed this out on YouTube that I didn't do this previously, so I've done it now. So there's iDisposable on there, and I'm disposing of my timer. So how is this actually going to work? How's the magic going to happen? Well, first of all, we're going to add in some base styles onto this div here. In this particular case, I'm going to want this div to be full height of whatever element it's in, so that's what hfull is doing for us. And then we get the fun stuff, so transition, okay, the transition property. What this is saying is whenever I change a value of a CSS property, I want it to be transitioned over a period of time. I don't just want it to flip from one value to another instantly. And I'm saying, in the next class, I'm saying I want that duration to be 500 milliseconds, so over half a second. And then I'm also using the transform class, which we saw earlier, okay, when we skewed that element. And that's because I want to move whatever elements we're wrapping around a bit, because I want to create this slide effect. And then the last thing there is I'm outputting whatever the value is of that animation styles field that I've got in my component. And this is really where the sort of secret sauce is. We're going to dynamically change the value of what's in that animation styles, and that's actually going to help create this effect for us. So we now need to add in the default styles so this is what the animation styles field is going to output when the component first runs. So the first one is translate x full. Now what this means is it's going to move whatever markup we've wrapped on the x-axis, so horizontal axis, it's going to move at 100% of its width to the right. So if we just quickly go back to our page, what that's going to do is push that panel off to the right of the screen. The other one is opacity 0. This is just going to make it transparent. All right. It's still going to take up physical space in the DOM. It's not like I'm hiding it or anything like that. I'm just making it invisible. So that's how it's going to start. When this component, whatever it's wrapping, it's going to make it invisible and push it off to the side of the screen, or make it transparent and push it off to the side of the screen. So a little bit of housekeeping here. So we're going to new up the timer, and we're going to give it a value of 300 milliseconds. And then we're saying when it elapses, call this trigger animation method, okay, which we haven't added in. So let's add that in now. And this method is the thing that's going to alter that animation styles. What it's going to do is it's going to get rid of the two classes that we've added and replace them with translate x0 and opacity 100. Now, it's quite important here to understand that these are manipulating the same CSS properties. And this is where having that transition class is going to come into play, and 500 milliseconds. Because what's going to happen when this trigger animation method runs and Blazor re-renders, and we get those new classes applied, because they're manipulating the same CSS properties, it's going to go, right, translate x0 means basically render where you are, render your default position. But we've pushed it off to the left, or off to the right, sorry. So it's going to move it back over 500 milliseconds. That's our slide effect. And also, just to make it a little bit more whizzy, we're also going to then turn up the opacity to 100. And again, it's going to happen over 500 milliseconds, so it's going to fade in. So this is going to create a slide and a fade effect for us. The final thing that we need to do here is actually put in some code to start the timer. So we're going to do that using the on-after-render lifecycle method. It's important to use this method because we're going to want to actually make sure that everything's rendered before we actually start anything going. We start the timer ahead of time, it can do some funky stuff. We're ensuring this only runs once by putting it behind this first render check. Okay. So once we've done that, we can go and see if our work is going to bear any fruit. So let's wrap this component. Let's rebuild that. Voila, sliding component, no JavaScript, done. So we'll just run that a couple more times, just so you can see it in action. It's only happening once, it's coming through. It's definitely sliding. So that's pretty cool. We've now got a reusable component that can slide stuff in, which we can use. We could also extend this if we wanted to. You know, you could have additional parameters that controlled where it slides from, so you can have it slide from the right or the left or top or bottom or whatever you want it to do. But the point here is I just want to show you that you can do this stuff by marrying these two technologies together, and you can obviously take this away and make it do even more funky stuff. The only thing here to point out, though, is there's kind of one little thing that niggles me. At the bottom here, you can just see for a second or two there is a scroll bar. And that's because the browser's being very helpful for us. It's going, well, you've got this thing that's outside of the viewport on the right-hand side, so you probably want to see it. So I'll get you a scroll bar so you can get over there, and we don't really want that to happen. So we can quickly fix this as well inside of the host page. What I'm going to do is on the body tag here, I'm just going to say overflow X hidden, so it just doesn't show that scroll bar. So I'm going to save that. We'll do a hot reload. It doesn't work. I have to refresh this. I've done this enough now that it kind of usually comes up. Oh, it's still not doing it. I don't know why. It never picks that one up initially. Anyway, there we go. So we're now not seeing that scroll bar at the bottom, okay? And we've now just got a nice, smooth animation effect. And you could do lots of other types of effects with this, you know, manipulating other things as you see fit, whatever your use case happens to be. So we'll move on to the last sort of big one, and that is dark mode. Dark mode's kind of becoming almost a staple of applications nowadays. As you can see from my UI, I'm a fan of dark mode. It's kind of really been paining me that my browser's in light mode at the moment, but there is a good reason for that, which we'll look at in a second. So dark mode is something that historically had to be turned on in Tailwind. With this new JIT compiler and this JIT engine, that's not the case anymore. It's there by default. And this is why my browser has been in light mode, because if we go into my browser settings go to appearance, and I put it back to my system default, we now have a dark mode website. Now, this is not magic. I have actually applied a load of classes to do this. Don't think that Tailwind is just suddenly working this out for me. I've already added them, but the point being here is dark mode is, the dark mode feature of Tailwind is on by default, and it's based on whatever your system preference is. Okay, so because my system preference is dark mode, it will apply dark mode classes if they exist. Okay. You can see here at the top, that navbar hasn't actually got any styles at the moment, so I thought we'll just go through that one quickly together so we can see what these look like. If we open up this. So the key bits here are like the main header element here has got a background of white. These nav links have text purple 700 as their color. There's various other elements that we're going to manipulate here. So if we just paste in the updated code, in order to get dark mode, all we do is create, sort of similar to a hover effect, we just use the dark variant and we say, when it's dark, apply this class instead. So I'm saying, when I'm in dark mode, apply BG Gray 700 instead of BG White. And you can see that just repeated across the other elements. So text purple 800, but when it's dark mode, it's text purple 400. All right. So if we save that, we'll do a reload, and now we've got our dark mode working on all of the bits. And that goes across all the rest of the site and all of this kind of stuff. So that's all working, which is cool. The only thing that's probably not possibly as great as it could be about this is what happens if, you're just having a light mode day. You're having one of those weird days where you just want to burn your retinas and what have you. It'd be much better if you could toggle this manually, okay? And you can decide as a user whether you want to see light mode or dark mode on a particular day. So we're going to build a component that's going to let us do this. Now, we do need to change the default dark mode configuration in Tailwind in order to make this work. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to do. If we go into our Tailwind config, what we do here is pop in, for the dark mode property, we're just basically going to set it to class. So that overrides just detecting whatever the system preferences are. Now, if we go and look back at our site now, it's gone back to light mode. And the reason for that is when we use the class mode, we have to have a class somewhere in the HTML tree called dark. And then any child elements from that element will have dark mode classes applied to them. So just to give you a practical example of that, if I go to the HTML element here and I add dark, like so, all the dark elements, all the dark variants now get applied. Okay, so that's going to be what our component is going to need to do. It's going to need to add and remove that class of dark from the HTML element. Now, in order to do this, we are going to use a little bit of JavaScript because Blazor can't actually get to that element and manipulate it on its own. So we are going to use a little bit of JavaScript in order to do that. So let's go in and have a look at how we can do this. So we're going to create a new component. And this is going to be called dark mode toggle. And let's pop in our class for that. So up here in this block of markup, this is what's going to actually create the toggle component for us, the look of it. What we'll do is, before we go any further, we'll just add this into the nav menu, and then we can just see what it looks like first, and I'll talk you through it. So we'll say dark mode toggle like so, save that. We'll do a reload. Cool. So this is basically what we've created. We've got this, probably it's quite common. You've probably seen it on quite a lot of sites. So how does this actually work, or how's it going to work? So we're using a kind of a usual trick for creating sort of nicer looking HTML controls here. We've got a label that wraps a div, and that's using a for attribute, and then that is going to toggle a hidden checkbox that we've got. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to hook onto that that checkbox in our Blazor code in order to extract the value and do whatever we need to do with it. So we're going to hook onto the onChange event. So every time that value changes, we're going to call this toggle theme method. And then we're also got, there's also a dark mode private Boolean here, and that's going to be used to set the value of a checkbox. All right. So if we've already got dark mode selected, we can reset it. Cool. So the first thing we'll do quickly is we'll just get the JavaScript bit out of the way. So I'm going to use a feature from Blazor that came in .NET 6, which is called co-located JavaScript. So I'm going to call this JavaScript file dark mode toggle.razor.js. So it's the same name as the component, but just with a JS extension. Now, if you're using Visual Studio, you get this like nice nested effect going on over there. And what I really like about it is it means that my JavaScript lives with the component that uses it, which is, I think, much better from a maintenance perspective. So Blazor supports JavaScript modules. This is a JavaScript module. So we're just exporting this one function called setTheme, which takes a theme string. And if the theme is dark, then we apply the dark class. And if it's not, then we remove the dark class. Okay, that's all it's doing. And it's just doing it on that HTML element that I showed you from the dev tools. All right. So nothing overly complex there. We can kind of save that off and kind of forget about that now. So let's actually see how we can use this module in our Razor component. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to need to import it into our Razor component. All right. So in order to do that, we need to create a field to store a reference. We can store references to JavaScript objects in Blazor by using the IJS object reference type. And then in on-after render, on the first render, we're going to go and we're going to use the IJS runtime, which is our interface into JavaScript from C# code. And we're going to use that to go and get that module. In order to do that, we use a certain syntax. We use the invoke async method. We set whatever the return type is going to be, so that IJS object reference. And then the first argument is a special keyword called import. And then the second argument is the path to that file that we want to go and import from. Okay. So that's going to get us our reference to our module. Again, because we're, being a responsible developer again, we're going to dispose of that correctly because we've now got this reference into JavaScript, which we do need to handle. So I'm going to use iasync disposable for this one because it supports iasync disposable and call dispose async if I need to. So I've set that up. The next thing that we can do is update this toggle theme method. So inside of here, this is the method that's going to get called by that hidden checkbox, okay, every time that we change the value. So what we're going to do is in that first line, we're going to extract whatever the value is, whether it's true or false. If it's true, dark mode becomes true, otherwise false. And then I've got this theme variable, which is going to, if dark mode's true, then I set it to dark, otherwise I set it to light. And then I'm going to call that setTheme function in JavaScript, and I'm going to pass in that variable. Okay, so it's going to pass down the string of either light or dark, depending on what I've got set. Cool, so let's save that. We'll give a reload. Let's have a look what happens now. Cool, so we have got a switch that's allowing us to go between light and dark mode. Okay, if you're curious about that little slide effect that's happening on the toggle, that's very similar to what we did on the slide-in component we built earlier. It's basically saying what happens here is it says when it's dark mode, transition it to the right by 3, which is what it does to create that slide effect. Okay, so similar technique to what we used before. So this is looking pretty good. The only downside here is if I refresh the page, it doesn't actually save my preference. So I think that's the last thing we can do to kind of make this a little bit better. Now, shameless plug here, I'm using one of my packages, Blazor Local Storage, in order to interface with the browser's storage APIs. So I've injected that, I've installed the NuGet package and then injected the service. And then what we can do is, after we set the theme, we can just add that call to local storage. And what we're going to say is set a theme key and then save whatever the theme value is that we've got. So we can do that, we can refresh. Cool, so we're in light mode. If I go to dark mode now and I hit refresh, okay, it doesn't work. Fair play, of course it doesn't work. I'm saving the value, but I'm not reading it out yet. So we'll deal with that. So after we load that module on the first render, we'll go off into local storage and we'll try and get that theme key, okay? Once we get that back, we'll determine whether we're going to be applying light or dark mode, and then we'll call into that set theme function in the same way, passing in whatever theme that we want. So with that done, let's go and have a look at our app. Voila. So it's remembered, or it's set dark mode previously, okay? So that's why when it's refreshed, it's remembered it for me. So I can toggle back to light mode, and if I hit refresh, it stays in light mode. And if I go to dark mode and I hit refresh, it stays in dark mode. And if we go into the browser tools, we can see here that theme key being stored here in local storage. Cool. So everything's looking pretty good. So we've gone through quite a few different techniques here and how we can use Blazor and Tailwind to create some cool effects. The last thing I kind of really want to quickly show is about how you can now go to production with this. How do you make this work when you've got a CI pipeline? Because obviously I'm running the CLI using my terminal, and that's generating all these classes as I go. But because that app CSS file it's generating and putting in the www root folder is dynamic, you wouldn't want to check that into your source control. Okay, so you're going to want your CI pipeline to be generating that file when it's doing a build of your application. Now, you've got options here. One of the options is that you could just add in a step into your build pipeline to run that npx command for you. That's definitely one way of doing it. The other way you can do that we're going to look at now is to actually leverage a bit of MS Build. So I'm going to open the project file here, and I'm going to add in a couple of targets into here. So the first one is kind of just a bit of kind of belt and braces stuff. What that's going to do is it's going to execute the npm-v command, and if it basically doesn't get a success code, it's going to fail the build. And this is just to make sure that npm is available wherever this is being built. Okay. The second one is kind of the interesting one. So firstly, it's going to run before the application's compiled. So this is going to happen first, then the main build of the application will happen. So this is going to ensure that our CSS file is available in order to be packaged up with the rest of our app. And we're going to execute that same npx command that we did in the terminal. We're going to pass in the input file, that style app CSS, and we're going to have the output file going into the www root folder as it was before. The cool thing, though, is we're going to pass in this other flag this time. Instead of doing --watch, we're going to do --minify. And that's because Tailwind CLI supports minification out of the box. Okay, we haven't got to go and do any other funky stuff in order to get that work. We can just pass in this extra flag. The other thing that we're doing here is setting the environment variable. So we need this node m production environment variable. Tailwind needs that in order for the minify stuff to work. And finally, we've got a check here, which is a .NET check, and it's saying that it's only going to execute this if we're in release mode. So when we're running in debug mode during development time, this isn't going to run. This isn't going to affect things. We'd just be letting our terminal deal with that. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So we've added that in. So if we just, what I'll do is I'll close all of these, and then we'll open out that output CSS file. If I change this to release mode and I rebuild the app in a second, hopefully, if all's gone well, voila. So it's really, really tiny. I apologize. I haven't zoomed this up. But first of all, you can see NPM versions being output there. It says 8.7.0. So that's that first target running. And then you can see that we've now only got one line of CSS. And that's because all of the minification process has happened and all of our stuff has been minified nicely. So we've now got a CSS file that only contains the utility classes that we use, and it's all been minified, so we're using the least space that we possibly can. Cool. So yeah, with that, I think that kind of brings us to a bit of a close. So if you do want any of the code or the slides for this, you can go to that URL at the top there, and you can download that from the Git repo. And yeah, I think, yeah, everything. Thanks very much. And yeah, if you want to ask questions, whatever, please feel free to grab me outside. Thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.